there are no disabled people. There are people who, because of their characteristics, find themselves on the wrong side of design decisions that somebody made a long time ago. So, there's no reason why things couldn't be accessible to people all the time. It's just that we made a decision before and then we doubled down on it. And so now, there's a step going into a restaurant that a wheelchair can't get up.
Welcome to the AttractionPros podcast, where we discuss the latest trends and challenges facing the attractions industry today.
We chat with some of the top leaders in the field and provide resources that will help develop your career in this great industry.
I am Josh Liebman, founder of BackLooper. I help attractions collect guest feedback and identify top priorities needed for improvement.
And I'm Matt Heller, founder of Performance Optimist Consulting. I help leaders lead so they can increase employee engagement and retention.
Now sit upright, hold on tight, and get ready for the AttractionPros podcast. Hey, Matt, how are you?
I think you know how I am, but I'm going to tell you anyway. I am fantastic.
I am so glad to hear that. You had me worried if you were anything less than that. I'm really excited for our guest today to get the opportunity to chat with Dr. Kathryn Woodcock, who is a professor at Ryerson University in Toronto, Ontario.
You know, what's really cool is that she approaches what we like to look at, but from a very scientific perspective, right? We can walk into a park and we can see how people are interacting with the equipment and things like that. But she kind of knows the background, the human factors piece, if you will. And I'm just fascinated to listen to her talk about how it all comes together and all those assumptions we might be making that really we shouldn't be making from a design standpoint, and how we can really open things up to more people if we design things a little differently.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're definitely going to talk a lot about the safety elements of the industry, because that is, of course, where human factors come in play at most. But she's also very passionate about accessibility within the industry as well. So we're able to talk about those issues, but also how they blend together, and that human factors and accessibility, of course, are not mutually exclusive by any means. So this is a really interesting conversation that, like we mentioned, we talk about what exactly does it mean when we say human factors. We're talking about the ergonomics of the operation, but like we said, for both guests and for employees as well. And she likes to call it a psychological judo and a physical judo, kind of a combination of those as well. So it'll be cool to hear her interpretation of that and what that means.
You know what I thought of when she first said that?
No.
I thought of The Mummy, because it was billed as a psychological thrill ride.
That's true.
So this episode is kind of a psychological thrill ride through the mind of Dr. Kathryn and human factors and all sorts of science that I'm sure I will never understand, but she explains it in such a great way that it's easy to comprehend, and I hope everybody enjoys it as much as we did.
That's right. So let's get ready for this psychological thrill ride. Are you insane? Get out of here. The curse, it's real. Or I would have enjoyed this interview a lot more if I had gotten my cup of coffee. All right, let's get to this fantastic interview with Dr. Kathryn Woodcock. Dr. Kathryn Woodcock, welcome to the AttractionPros podcast. We are so excited to have you here today. How are you?
I'm good. I'm cold here in the frozen north, but I'm good.
Absolutely. It's that time of year, right? So as we get started here, can you just give us a quick background, tell us what you do, and maybe a quick overview of your career?
So I'm a professional engineer and an ergonomist, and I started my professional career in the healthcare business. I was a hospital vice president for 10 years, and then I decided I had had enough real life and went back to do a PhD specializing in industrial engineering, human factors engineering. And I was interested at that time in the topic of causal explanation in accident investigation, because you don't fix the safety problem you have, you fix the safety problem you think you have. And so how you investigate an accident is really an important part, a building block of that process. And along the path, I intersected with the inspection domain. And the inspection domain led me into the attractions business, looking at amusement ride inspection through organizations like NARSO and AIMS.
So prior to your involvement in the attractions industry, were you a fan of amusement parks? Were you a consumer of the product? Or what was it like getting into the industry initially?
No, not so much. I had been to parks and incidentally, you know, as a kid traveling across the country, going to the Calgary Stampede or going to Fantasy Island and Grand Island, New York. But this isn't really a hotbed of the attractions industry. At least it wasn't in the day of my childhood. I would look at the advertising on the back page of comic books, amusement parks in the southern US, but that wasn't where I grew up. I grew up in a pretty Markham Fair kind of carnival world. And of course, that was definitely a ritual. You know, you would save your money all year to go to the Canadian National Exhibition or the Markham Fair.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Catherine, can you talk a little bit, maybe in broad terms, and then we'll get a little bit more specific about some of the things that you do study in the attractions industry and how your work really, you know, impacts the operator?
So I think the one element that's unavoidable in this business, in the attractions industry, is the guests. They come in clutching their fistful of dollars, and it's important that the operations cater to them, that it meets their needs emotionally, you know, to keep them coming back, and physically to keep them safe and comfortable. But there are events that occur, you know, people having minor slips and falls, or people being very uncomfortable with the rides. There are times when the rides and the people don't match as well as we would like. So it occurred to me that as I was standing around watching, you know, ride inspections and hearing inspectors talk about the things that don't go well in the course of a day, there was opportunities to apply human factors engineering to that beyond just the narrow scope of inspection.
So when we talk about the concept of human factors, can you give us a quick overview of what all that includes specifically in amusement parks and attractions?
Yeah, so human factors or ergonomics, sort of synonymous terms. A lot of people think of ergonomics in terms of, you know, the neck down, you know, the things that happen to your back when you're lifting boxes, or the things that happen to your wrists when you're working at a keyboard. And human factors is often used to refer to the process, you know, from the neck up, where people are goofing and making mistakes when they're trying to perform a task. Things that people do to ruin the process, as opposed to ergonomics, often used to describe the way the process ruins the person. But really it's all part of the same puzzle. People do a physical thing because they're trying to get information, or people can't process information because they're uncomfortable. You know, the body and the mind are interconnected very closely when people interact. So in attraction, you know, it involves both the body and the mind, the physical sensations and the anticipation and the psychological, you know, optical illusions we give to people and that sort of thing. It is a really good application area for human factors.
So Catherine, do you do work on both sides of the fence, meaning focused on the guests as well as employees that are out there working every day?
Yeah, so on stage and backstage both have human factors elements. This is sort of where I justified going into this area of research. I figured I was standing there watching the backstage process, and then there would be a break in the action, and I would look at the stuff going on stage, you know, making the most of my time. So instead of studying safety inspection across a whole bunch of different industries, I thought I would study a whole bunch of different human factors things across this one industry. And it was the best, I justified it's the best use of my time to do that. I get to spend all my time on the midway, but just for science, you know. So yeah, so there are things the way operators or designers or inspectors, they're interacting with the technology, and then they hand it over to operations and they bring the guests in the gate, and then the guests interact with the technology. So we are all humans and we are all interacting with this process.
So you've mentioned that some people consider human factors to be a soft science with subjective perceptions. Can you expand a little bit onto that?
Yeah, because, well, when you put a certain load on a piece of steel, it's going to bend. You have a certain amount of knowledge about how much load you can put on that steel and how much it's going to bend and at what point it's going to break. The same with wood, and the same with, different kinds of materials. People don't work quite as predictably, but there's going to be a range that people vary within. And so what human factors enables you to do is to describe the kinds of things that might happen and where in the process things might, start to get a little bit bumpy. They won't do what you can do with steel and wood and other materials, which is to say, at this time, at this point, with this amount of pressure, that thing is going to snap. You can't do that with humans. Humans, you might be able to say they're definitely going to snap, but is it going to be after 400 people using it, or is it going to be the millionth person using it, or is it going to be the first person using it? It's more random in terms of when it's going to happen. It's foreseeable enough that there is a range of responses, but we don't know which person it's going to be and which time it's going to be.
So you mentioned that the mind and the body are all connected, and I absolutely agree that everything that we do is kind of a combination of all of that. Is there a lot of psychology that also goes into human factors engineering?
Yeah, so the field of human factors is populated really by three branches of science. There are the psychologists who come in, and there are the kinesiologists and biomechanists who come in, and there are the engineers who come in. So human factors conferences are full of people talking from different backgrounds. It's a really rich and interesting field, because you have to, in the course of training for the profession, you have to come in with one of those three, and you have to learn bits of the others in order to be the full package.
Really interesting. So one of the things, particularly one of the sessions you spoke in at the recent IAPA conference back in November was about human factors and attractions. And there were a lot of interesting pieces of information that you discussed in that session. And one was about hazards related to guests when they are visiting parks that they might not necessarily be aware of because they're in an unfamiliar environment. And, whether they're riding rides or other areas of their visit, how can these hazards be made more intuitive for guests? We talk often about how when guests visit a theme park, sometimes they're leaving their brain in the car. They're not always thinking about their own safety while they're visiting a park. So I believe that the human factors probably needs to come into play when communicating hazards to guests, while also keeping them not just safe, but also comfortable and enjoyable while they're visiting a park.
So I'd be a little bit more charitable. I don't mean to be an apologist, for jackassery and that kind of thing, but I would say they don't leave their brain in the car. They're going into a place that's not just unfamiliar, but it's full of optical illusions and, storytelling and distraction. It's a hugely sensory cavalcade of stimuli. And you're not selling them hazards, you're not selling them safety, you're selling them excitement, you're selling them social interaction with each other, social interaction with strangers, all these exciting things that are happening in the environment. And so that is your goal. If you ask them to say, remember, oh, by the way, there are these three laws of physics that could be really important to you in the middle of the afternoon, maybe later, hold those in mind, because physics, it could hurt you. You might have better safety, but you've missed your mission, which is fun and escapism. You don't want to have people having to keep the illusory world, the narrative world, and also the lumpy laws of physics keeping both of those things in their head all day, that's not a fun day. What you need to do is figure out ways to make the boundaries of behavior within your story world coincide with the boundaries of behavior of the physics world, so that maybe you don't do this behavior that could hurt you because of physics. Instead, you don't do it because it doesn't seem to be fun, or it would violate the witch's spell that the witch has cast, whatever. If you give them a story reason or like an illusion reason, I often recommend things like, if it would be dangerous to take a certain behavior, make it seem super dangerous, make it seem much more dangerous than it actually is within the context of the world, not with a big yellow sign that says, danger, danger, don't do things. Or remember this later, you'll need this piece of information. Instead, build into the immediate here and now environment intuitive boundaries of go, no go. And that will stand you in better stead, because not only does it avoid the problem of having to remember that piece of information that conflicts with your story, but it can also enhance your story by making the story more exciting and more thrilling. And I think that, the people in this industry, I've never met such a creative, capable group of people for coming up with different ways of solving problems. And this is exactly the kind of application that needs to happen.
Kathryn, earlier you were talking about you can't measure on a human, like, when they're going to snap, but they might at some point. And now I hear you talking about, putting those barriers into place to kind of keep people safe, but not break down the illusion. Well, now we have to think about, we have thousands of people that come visit us. So now we have thousands of different perceptions and experiences. So can you describe any best practices to create those barriers so that we're creating the best, safe, most well-told story for the majority of people? Because I think that's another challenge as well.
Yes, so you're basically designing for the most vulnerable person at any given point in time. So you have 35,000 people a day and only 5 of them get into trouble. That's still 5 cases you have to manage now. So, you don't want any of those 5 cases. So the other 34,995 people get it and they do exactly what you want them to do. But those 5 people, you design for the 5 vulnerable people.
Cool.
That's really interesting. So what does that really look like then, as to not maybe impede on the remaining 34,995 to have that full balance that creates a unique and consistent experience while also designing for the most vulnerable?
So if you're thinking of horizontally revolving ride, one of the problems that you see with people is they get to a certain age, particularly girls, because I think at a certain age, boys want to be risk takers. They go to the skate park or something and they do daredevil hijinks in private property. But the girls, they might continue to come to these venues and they push the envelope and start to rise up in the seat, try and feel that weightlessness. And you don't want them to do that because they could get hurled out of the side of the ride. So you want to think of ways you can make that acceleration force intuitively obvious, rather than take them aside in the queue and say, "Now, girls, I'd like to give you a physics lesson." Instead, make it obvious to them as they're feeling that horizontal acceleration with their gut. Show them what would happen to an unrestrained thing. Like, you don't want them to hold a tennis ball and let go and have it go hit another guest in the head. So I'm thinking this is pushing the creative envelope. I have things that I might imagine doing for any of these situations, but I'm not monopolizing the ability to come up with a solution. I think creative designers, if they turn their head around and say, "Well, darn it, why don't people follow my rules?" they will never get there. They have to decide that they want to get there. How do I make the acceleration more obvious so people will be more afraid of it and they'll sit the heck down? That should be your design brief. And then you'll come up with more creative options, rather than saying, "Well, I think I can have a buckle and I can have an instruction, I can have a warning sign, I can make the mother sit with them. You know, those are sort of halfway solutions that patch over the problem that the rider in that particular age range, they don't understand enough physics to work out the consequences of rising up in the seat. So you might have people stepping or going into the wrong direction, going into the wrong zone of your property, or you might have people reaching out, trying to take a picture because, you know, that's built within their mission for being there, which is socializing and having a sensory experience, and they're not seeing things outside that goal space. They're seeing their goals and they're seeing the apparatus and they're figuring out a plan. And you have to figure out ways of serving their goals in a way that subverts their original improvisation and gives them a safer way of doing it.
So can you expand a little bit more on some of those creative solutions that you've seen? You mentioned, you know, the initial reaction might be to put an extra seatbelt in or have their parents sit with them. What are some of those other creative, maybe storytelling elements that you've seen that has helped with that rather than just putting another seatbelt in?
So I've given one example of a case where guests trying to board a ride vehicle may have intuitively tried to enter the ride vehicle from opposite sides, like you would with a passenger car. You don't get into a passenger car all on the same side and then slide to the farthest seats, you know, but that's what we have to do with a ride with a row of seats. So if the guests perceive it to be too much like a passenger car, they might intuitively do this because, you know, they've been in the queue for quite some time. It's a hot attraction. They're there with their significant other and their party. They're having a conversation all the way through the queue. And then now it's their turn to ride and they're so excited. And so they're not, you know, thinking, I think I will put my left foot down and then I'll put my right foot a little bit further beyond. They're not consciously, you know, working through their physical execution. They're working at an intuitive level. And in that split second, if they decide they're going to go around the front of the vehicle to get in on the other side, they're going to trip over the tracks or they're going to fall into a pit below if it's a raised up boarding station, and that you don't want them to do that. So you have to step back and look around and say, here is my boarding station and it's full of all this brilliant excitement, but the place I want my guests to go, it's dark. It's I don't mean repelling in a repulsive kind of sense, but it fends off your attention. Everything else is grabbing your attention, and that's where your attention is going to go. Your eyes are going to go. You're not going to say, I need to walk in here and go down to the end there, because there's nothing that is drawing your attention toward that. So a creative solution would be illuminate that place where you want people to be, draw them with the light, whether it's a projected light or whether it's a built-in, LED landing strip kind of thing. There are lots of technical ways to execute it, but pull them rather than try to block them away or push them off. Pull them where you want them to be.
So if I understand that correctly, you're saying there's multiple different elements of maybe engaging the senses or their attention to, in a way, control and manipulate guest behavior to get them to do something you want them to do. And the example that you gave is go the right direction to get into the ride vehicle. I imagine there's many other applications of that as well, even in terms of maybe operational efficiency or, the way that they spend money or direct their actions and movements in certain ways as well. So I'm curious as far as what other applications are there to be able to, I would say, influence those human factors in your guests to make sure they are following the rules and doing what you want them to do?
Yeah, so I don't mean this to sound flippant, but if you want guests to follow the instructions you write on a sign what guests are going to do intuitively. Because you're more likely to have success there if you describe what they're intuitively going to do. So your first game is to try and figure out what is the environment telling people. there are products from a certain consumer product company where you take them out of the box and you see the company's name on the box, and that's the last you ever see of the box. You don't look at the manual, you don't look at the instruction, you hold the product in your hand and you know exactly what to do with it. That's what we want the attraction environment to be like, so that the person sees it and they know exactly what to do. They know that they're supposed to sit down now. They know they're supposed to get up now. They know exactly what to do, not because there's a label or there was a sign in the queue, but because it's obvious from what I'm looking at as a rider in this moment. And that's the tricky part, because we other the rider. We think of them as, you know, the weak link, rather than the person who is just being who they are. So I'm not sure, you know, where I was going with from the original question you asked me, but I'm thinking of this in an analogy of kind of like, I don't know any martial arts, I should say this, but judo, my understanding is you're using the person's own body momentum against them. Human factors would be kind of like a psychological judo and a physical judo, you know, figuring out what they want and then finding a way to substitute an easier way for them to get what they want, so that they're not even going to come up with any other ways. It's so obvious what I have to do. I open this mobile phone and I know exactly where to touch to turn it on. I don't have to read any instructions. That's what you want your attraction to be like when they come into encounter it for the first time. And you want it to keep that magic when they're encountering it for the 40th annual pass holder time as well, you know, so that you build in those layers of discovery for them, all within the parameters of you know, intuitive rather than instructional.
You know, one of the things I'm curious about, because I started in my career about 30 years ago, you know, running rides that were nowhere near as complex or, you know, deep in story as they are right now. You open a gate and people walk in and they get on the ride. You know, there's no place to put a light to drive them there and things like that. So I'm curious, you know, it's one thing to talk about places like Universal and Disney where they have that kind of infrastructure, but then you have a small mom and pop operator and they've got a tilt-a-whirl or a paratrooper ride. So what are some things that they need to be concerned with from a human factors standpoint so they can keep their guests safe as well?
Yeah, so I often think of those, batch type of rides, the carnival rides or FEC rides that when they were designed for not even my generation, but my father's generation, for example, where a sign of growing up meant mastery of the correct method for using a piece of equipment. You know, you learned to drive and you drove the car properly, and that was a sign that you were, you know, mature. And over time, it's evolved to these devices like cars and whatever else are apparatus for you to explore in your self-expression. And we can't lament that. That's just the way it is. People don't look at a tilt-a-whirl as a thing that you are going to experience the correct way because you're grown up now and you're mature. It's an apparatus that will induce some sensations in your body. What can I do with those sensations? How can I get that on YouTube or put it on a TikTok or whatever? The world is now an apparatus for people to self-actualize rather than for people to, you know, march in the direction of proper behavior. And that's just, the world has changed and we're still riding rides that were designed 80 years ago. So they're designed for a different user base. So we have to figure out ways of packaging that for that population. You're not going to change the tilt-a-whirl. It's a beloved classic ride, but you have to be conscious that your guests are not my dad. Your guests are today's kids, and they're going to perceive it differently. They're going to process the experience differently. They might behave differently. So the ride attendants have to be aware. They have to know how to intercept the behavior. So as they see the warning signs of it, you can't do it by looking at people in the queue. I have a lovely video of a teacup ride. I was trying to talk to people about accessibility and eligibility for riding, because people often have in their mind categories of people who shouldn't ride because, you know, disability could be dodgy. So I was in this park one day and I was just getting some B-roll background footage of this teacup ride, and I could see a guy in the middle of the ride cycle trying to stand up in a teacup with like 3 or 4 people in it, but he wasn't the guy you would have thought. You know, you have in your mind the kinds of guests who get into trouble, who have impulse control problems. This was an adult man, like either of you could have been that guy. So you can't predetermine who it's going to be, but somebody's going to do that. So as soon as you see the hand's not on that wheel anymore, the operator has to be, somebody's got free hands now. They are now no longer connected to the teacup. I might need to stop this or slow the rotation down. So, you know, you can't avoid having an operational solution sometimes. It can't always, in the FEC or Carnival world, it can't always be a design solution. You've got a perfectly good ride that's served you well for 40 years, and you want to keep it. But you have to make sure the operators know the kinds of things people will do and how they should intercept those.
Yeah.
So is there a point then where operators would say, we've done all we can to control and influence the guest behavior and to eliminate unsafe actions? And as far as what extent should operators be focusing on human-related safety factors that include following all the protocols, meeting all safety guidelines, OSHA, et cetera, knowing that guests might have conflicting motivations, or staff members sometimes too. But I think of an example many years ago where there was an incident. We don't need to get into the specifics of it, but it involved an individual climbing over a fence. And I remember seeing, I don't know if it was the park's attorney or whoever it was being interviewed and almost debated on TV. And he said something to the extent of, there was a 6-foot fence there. The operator was completely compliant and you know, completely, you know, not guilty of any wrongdoing on their behalf. And the person, I believe it was the reporter, or maybe it was another attorney, said, well, there was a 6-foot fence, but there should have been a 10-foot fence. And he said, well, if he's going to climb a 6-foot fence, he was going to climb a 10-foot fence. And then he extended it further. He threw his arms up and he said, should we bring in a busload of nuns and they should just patrol the fence at multiple areas to stop people? So he kind of showed how ridiculous it almost seemed.
That will not fix anything.
So at what point is it, we've done all we can, you're a human who's going to now make the decision whether you're going to follow the rules and stay on this side of the fence, or if you're going to break the rules and deal with the consequences of that action.
It's not about the height of the fence. If a person is found and determined to be on the other side of the fence, that can happen. So what you have to have is a process that knows when they've crossed that line and a response pattern that will save them from further harm. If they don't fall off immediately as soon as they get to the top of the fence and, you know, are unable to climb down, whatever you have on the other side needs to make sure that the operator can respond quickly to keep them out of trouble. So that's the key, is not assuming that errors or failures won't happen, but that you have a recovery. So if things fail in a graceful way, they give you a chance to intercept. So, you know, if I see the guy taking his hands off the wheel, I see somebody encroaching within the perimeter fence, you know, I have this visual pattern of what's going on and I see a discrepancy with that, then I instantiate my plan B, which is how I intercept. Now that might be the e-stop, and maybe it's not the e-stop. Maybe the e-stop is not the right solution for it. So you have to figure out in every unique context what that response is going to be. Some things are easy to perceive those patterns in, and other things are difficult. You know, in the carnival world, I stand on the kiddie midway and I'm looking at the bumblebee ride, the spinner, and it's really, really hard to tell if people are sticking their arms and legs out, because every one of those bees is sticking its leg out also. It's really hard to tell if there's a kid sticking their leg out or an adult rider sticking their leg out. So, you know, if you make it easy for the operators to perceive those discrepancies, then you also help, because Now you know people will eventually, somebody will do that thing. Now what? And make it easy for them to tell that it's happened and to remember what they do.
You know, I'm really glad that you're talking about how important and integral the ride operator is, as we just talk about rides, to that process. And going back to your teacup example, when you see somebody taking their hands off, you've got to be watching what's your next step when that happens. Obviously, keeping your eye on them. You may have to hit the e-stop or stop the ride. Because I actually had a boss a long time ago who would say, well, we have to make the rides easier to run. We have to make them idiot proof, right? So that anybody can do it. And then I think what ended up happening is we took away that intuitive desire to watch the ride and be responsible for it, because we're saying that the ride's going to do everything for us. And so I would be curious in your perspective of how do we ensure, as rides get sort of quote unquote easier to run because the computer's doing a lot more of it, how do we now ensure that that ride operator is still as diligent as they should be? Yeah.
So in addition to not being a martial artist, I'm also not a pilot, but the way I understand flying airplanes is there is some degree of automation you have in those as well. And that has been a classic area of human factors from day one. And they encountered this problem with autopilot, with, operator out of the loop. So once you let the automation handle things, you are less aware of what situation you're in. One thing I noticed with a lot of carnival ride type thing, I'm not talking about a dark ride with a tower control, but like a ride where the operator is looking directly at the device. You look at those interfaces, they're not mapped on to the system response at all. So if you are not in automated mode, try figuring out which one of those 20 buttons or 30 buttons you should press in order to have this tailor-made intervention. It's very difficult for them to figure it out. If your dashboard of your car was designed like this, you'd have a whole row of push buttons, and they would go left, 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 right, 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 straight, 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 slow, 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 fast, fast, fast. That's not the way you want to drive a car. You want to drive a car like this. I did see a giant wheel with a control that was like this. I think the guy made it himself, and he was on to something with that to make it easier. If you have to make a split-second reaction and choose exactly the one control object that's going to make the response you need the ride to have, the interface has to help you. Now, those expert operators, they know the ride like the back of their hand, but can you rely on a steady supply of those guys? Or would you rather have the flexibility to hire, new people from time to time? And how long are you going to wait for them to get that back of your hand knowledge of what you have to do with the interface? It would be better if you start looking at interfaces as things that would help you form and maintain a situation awareness, so that there were these oddball situations that come up, you have a way. If you're operating in an automatic mode, it doesn't matter. But when you switch from every day, nothing's unusual, to, oh, wait, this is different, that's the time when it needs to be super obvious what needs to happen and how to make it happen. And that's the time when it gets more difficult to figure out what to do. So we're catering to the everyday 99.9% of the time in the interface design. And we don't cater enough to that, fraction, the tiny fraction of oddball situations. So we could help a little bit more with that, I think.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that, the people who are operating rides, like you said, there are those few that know it like the back of their hand. Maybe they've been operating that particular ride for many years, but the bulk of ride operators, or, most amusement park and attraction employees, don't come with specific specialized skills and training. It's all, of course, being done in-house. So what are some ways then that automation is able to minimize operator error? You gave the example of the pilot and the airplane dashboard. And, so it seems that automation should be implemented, of course, to an extent. And so I guess curious as far as just ways of the best ways that it can apply to help the operator and minimize error.
My governing principle is that if you want people to keep in the loop, you have to keep them engaged. But automation can help monitor the person. In aviation, for instance, automation will monitor if the pilot seems to be getting fatigued, if the automation detects the reaction time isn't as good as it might be, or even my car now, my new car will say, do you need a coffee? You seem to be deviating from the lane a little bit. I don't drink coffee, so it bothers me. I don't have my choice of beverage. But the automation can monitor your performance. If it detects something and if it was fully automated, it would have made a certain action, and yet you didn't do that action. The automation can start to, meet you in the middle a little bit more. So that would be one thing, automation monitoring humans instead of humans monitoring automation. That makes a lot more sense to me. Another thing is using automation to translate individual pieces of information into the interface and present it in an integrated way. So that requires, a little bit more heavy lifting interface design wise, but it would enable you people are not so good at integrating discrete pieces of information. People are really good at understanding a pattern once it's presented as a pattern. And so if we have automation that can integrate the information and say, okay, this is what we're dealing with, the operator can go, oh yes, I know what to do in that situation. So using automation behind the scenes to let the operator continue to be in control and make the operator, you don't want the operator to literally lift the tub and move the riders around in a circle. You obviously want hydraulics to do that. But you would like the operator on the control panel to feel like they are manually moving the riders around so that they are fully engaged and maintain that situation awareness so that if a weird thing does happen, they're on the ball.
I think it's so funny that you mentioned the coffee example because, before COVID, I traveled a lot and I rented a lot of cars. And there was one time I had a drive of like 4 hours, and about 2 hours into the drive, the little thing pops up and it says, the car has been moving for 2 hours or something like that. It's time to stop and get a coffee, something like that. I was like, wow, this is kind of strange. But, we've been talking a lot about rides, and certainly, Josh and I have a background in rides, and obviously a lot of the research you've done is in rides, but I'm also curious about other departments, food and beverage or merchandise, or even on the maintenance side. What sort of human factors considerations do we have to look at in some of those other areas of our operation?
One approach I used when I was first learning the business, I would go to NARSO and Ames and I would go through the steps of training to be a ride inspector. I'm still a little bit intimidated about writing the exams, but learning all those principles, that was one thing, but learning what it feels like to be going through the process from not knowing to knowing a little bit to knowing more and so on. And I shadowed inspectors I've been doing it now for 18 years, shadowing the inspectors on the Carnival Midway. So understanding their thought process of how they deconstruct problems and the kinds of things I would notice thinking, there's human factors in there. You'd see a carnival ride, you bring it into the lot, you put it up on blocks, you float the wheels and that sort of thing. Then the inspectors come in and they have some, rules of thumb. They say if there's a leg, or where's the blocking under it? If there's a hole, what should be in the hole? They have some heuristics for feeling their way around before they start getting into the nitty gritty of an inspection. And yet there are some rides where there are holes that don't take a pin. It's just a transportation tie down or something, or leg that's a transportation leg. And so a novice inspector comes fresh off of their training and they say, I now know there's a hole. What should be in that hole? I'm going to throw the book at you. And then the operator who knows the ride, from having worked on it for years, says something like, that hole doesn't take a pin. It's not, here's the manual, look, there's no hole, there's no pin in this hole. And so the inspector is deflated and they're intimidated, and that doesn't reinforce their confidence about all the very good heuristics that would apply 99.9% of the time. So why can't we make those holes and those legs look different underneath the ride? Why can't we make the transportation legs a different color than the legs that need to have blocking? Have the footings that, you know, the mud cells and whatever underneath the ride, make them look, this one absolutely needs good solid blocking, and maybe we'd end up with better blocking than sometimes we see in a mobile ride setup. All these international cases where carnival rides have fallen off their blocks and that sort of thing. There's a miscommunication between the ride that the second-hand, third-hand, fourth-hand owner has acquired and what they understand to do. Make that ride communicate to the owner, I need structural support. I need to be leveled with that other leg over there. I'm a pin, I need to have a hole in it. This is what kind of pin it needs to, I'm a hole, I need to have a pin in it. What kind of pin does it need to be? An experienced inspector knows, you know, those rules of thumb. They look at two pins doing the same job and they say if they're not the same kind of pin, one of those two pins or possibly both of them is not the right pin. And then a super experienced inspector would go, oh, they're the same, they have the same performance level, but the novice doesn't know. And every time the novice gets smacked down and gets embarrassed by one of those things, it prolongs their novice state rather than their progression to expertise. So if the ride did something to help them know for sure, this needs to be done and it hasn't been done, and this is the remedy I need to prescribe to the owner or to my boss if I'm the inspector for the company, make me feel confident about my recommendation. That is a really good application of human factors, make people more competent at their work by making the device talk. Also,
make the device
techniques I use for being able to find human factors problems, you know, as I will cruise through a place and I will look for all the post-it notes that people have left. Or have you ever seen control panels where people have taken a key and they've scratched a message onto it and then they let it corrode? So now you have this permanent notation on the control panel, always load buckets number 1, 4, 7, and 11 before all the other buckets in order to balance this wheel. So obviously it's not obvious to the new operators. It needs to be written there. It needs to be made more obvious. Make those tubs a different shape or make them a different color, make it more obvious. Don't just put numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then expect people to memorize which numbers have to be loaded first to get a balanced wheel. Make the design do more heavy lifting and less memory.
That's interesting. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So when it comes to operator error, can you talk a little bit about the difference between a mistake, a lapse, and a slip, and what the differences are between those three?
Well, a slip would be having the correct intention, but hitting the next button over. So you're trying to keep your eye on the process. So you don't want to take your eye off of it and look for the button label. You want to reach out and feel the button, but it's very close to the button you want, and it's feels the same shape, you know, so you hit the wrong one because you're quite rightly concentrating on balancing your process. So a slip is the intention is correct, you just couldn't execute it in the moment because of the way things were designed. A lapse is you should have done something, but you didn't. So you're supposed to check all the lap bars, but you got interrupted. And so you missed a row and the ride is ready to dispatch and a bunch of people don't have their lap bars done up. The mistakes are the ones we usually think of when we think of errors. We think errors are people making dumb decisions. Mistakes are possibly dumb decisions, but often they're just misguided decisions. So the person misunderstands the situation they're in and they think the action they're choosing is appropriate. They're not trying to be idiots. So, you know, trying to make something idiot-proof is sort of not a fruitful approach. People aren't trying to be idiots. They just don't understand what's going on. There's too much happening all at once, and they're overwhelmed with decisions to make or information to absorb, and so they make the best decision they can at the moment. And so, you know, you have a revolving ride, multi-axial ride, and it's all up in the air, and you discover that it starts to be on fire, or there is a an object falling out of the sky and it's going to hit the run. You want to bring it down, but instead of bringing ride stop, you press e-stop and now it's up there in the air because you cut the power now. That would be a mistake. It's not an idiot action. It's a misunderstanding the situation and the action possibilities situation.
So a mistake may not be the fault of the individual making the mistake in many circumstances. It might be as a result of either training or misguided leadership or influence in some cases.
Yes, I would say it's most of the time it's a design problem. Well, maybe not. I don't want to be accusatory of designers, but maybe to say it's a problem that could be fixed with design. So if it's too opaque to see what's going on, we have this theory of the 7 stages of action, from perception to cognition, recognition, decision, the gulf of evaluation, what is going on, and the gulf of execution, what action options are available to me, and how do I make those actions occur. Those 2 things are very often very opaque. It's difficult to tell what's going on. It's difficult to tell what will happen if I do this certain thing. And so you end up with people making mistakes. Now, maybe you could say, well, I gave him training and he didn't remember it. I mean, I'm a professor. I know lots of stuff about telling people things and having them not do them. So there are probably times when you want to say, I wish people would do what I have taught them. But there are also things you can do yourself to make no other options available to them, make it more obvious what they have to do, pre-select and ask them to confirm, that sort of thing, rather than trying to put so much burden on them to remember exactly what they need to do, what order they need to do it in, when they need to start doing it, and when they absolutely must not do it. So that's the hard part, is expecting people to be flawless, and things vary so much. That's a lot to keep in mind.
I think that's a great lesson, both for guests and for employees. Don't expect people to be flawless, right? And from a trainer, I know exactly what you're talking about telling people or suggesting things and they don't do it maybe the first time or until they really want to do it. That's when it kind of becomes a little bit more natural. I'd like to shift gears just a little bit, because I know one of the other things that you're passionate about is accessibility. So can you talk to us a little bit about what are some of the mistakes or the things that are overlooked when people are looking at creating an accessibility plan or even implementing that plan?
Well, the first thing I would say is there are no disabled people. There are people who, because of their characteristics, find themselves on the wrong side of design decisions that somebody made a long time ago. So, there's no reason why things couldn't be accessible to people all the time. It's just that we made a decision before and then we doubled down on it. And so now, there's a step going into a restaurant that a wheelchair can't get up, or there's instructions that are only on a text-based sign and blind people can't read it, or there's something, my personal pet peeve is, you have a ride, you're telling a story, you've put millions of dollars into this wonderful, beautiful new attraction, but for some reason, the only way guests can understand the story is if a character I call Captain Exposition stands there in front of the guest and explains what's happening. And they're in a splendid costume, and they're, makeup, and they're performing and everything for however many dispatches a day, over and over again, performing this. Or you put up a hologram and you have that Captain Exposition in a hologram. What can I do with that? Why can't your story be more obvious on its own without Captain Exposition standing there giving me that narration? So, I don't really think accessibility is a list of things that you tick off on a checklist. It's a list of assumptions you make that you maybe need to question when you're making a new attraction. Why do I have to have Captain Exposition narrating this? Why can't it be obvious that interlopers have intruded in our place and there are poachers now, or an enemy army, or whatever Captain Exposition is telling me? There's certain really massive, expensive, highly recognized brand new attractions I can't make head nor tail of because Captain Exposition is the star of the show. So I can't speak with total authority of people with every other disability, but I can certainly tell you in my everyday life, you know, having a text narration or working on contraptions that would convert Captain Exposition to a text caption on my face, or, you know, putting it on the wall. But why do I even need the narration? Why can't it be obvious enough for me to understand without narration? And the same for, you know, people who are blind. Why do they need to read an inscription? Why can't they hear? Why can't they just know what the environment, what story the environment is telling them? So we're not shut out because an accessibility checklist hasn't been completed. It's because certain design assumptions people are making. Everyone can hear, everyone can see, everyone can walk, and then we'll deal with those other people afterwards once we've worked out what the attraction will look like. That's the wrong time to start thinking about accessibility.
Yeah, I like how you phrased that and then talked about it as an assumption. And I'll share a quick story during the IAPA virtual education conference. And I may have told this story, Josh, so you may have heard this before, but there was a point at which I was listening to the presentation. I was walking my dog and just listening to the opening presentation. And they said that they were gonna, you know, share a spot from one of the sponsors. And on that, you know, I'm listening on my headphones, and during that piece, there was no indication about what the whole thing was. They assumed that people were going to be watching, right? So there was no Captain Exposition telling me what that product was all about. So I still think it was a nice 2 minutes of music that I got to listen to while I was walking, but I still have no idea what that product was that was trying to be advertised. So, you know, even in that situation, you know, that small assumption, you know, cost them some visibility.
Yes, we do make those assumptions, and it's sort of like a holdover from the past design conventions. So, you know, in the United States, I'm not an American, so where I live, we don't even have the ADA, but the United States has had the Americans with Disabilities Act for 30 years now. And it's astonishing. There are designers who have had ADA their entire lives, and yet it's still considered to be a fringe add-on that you make, instead of assuming that there will be a range of abilities or a range of preferences. You know, your preference to hear the narrated sponsor list instead of seeing this beautiful graphic. You know, there are lots of people who have English fluency as an additional language, not as their first language, and they like captioning because it enables them to double check what they're hearing and, you know, make sure that they've recognized the right word, maybe familiarize themselves with the correct spelling, you know, reinforce the correct spelling. There's lots of audiences that want all of these things. You look at any theme park, there are a lot of guests who wheel around the theme park, and it's not because they're missing any legs, it's because they're 18 months old. So as soon as you make things accessible to wheeling people, you make it accessible to all kinds of people who need level access to things, employees pushing carts, babies in strollers, everything else. So as long as you marginalize and make it a weird thing, it will never be easy. But as a universal design principle, you have more options on the table by starting early. And I think one of the reasons why this interests me, aside from, you know, my vested interest and selfish, you know, benefit from it, is from a human factors perspective. We don't need to think of disability and non-disability. We need to think about, what does this experience ask of people, and what do people need to bring to the experience to be able to interact with it or engage with it effectively and enjoyably, you know, accomplish the mission of the engagement of the person and the experience. And so if that list of things is, well, they need to have 2 arms, they need to have 2 legs, they need to see, they need to hear, they need to be able to speak, they need to be able to smell, the difference between 3 closely related varieties of flowers or whatever, you have to ask yourself, why? Why do I have to design something that demands so much of my guests? if I want to have 17 million guests a year coming to my facility, I really should be more flexible with the abilities you need to have to fully experience this new thing that I'm making. And you don't have to, you have this, the human population varies in kind of a bell curve, you know, the sort of average level of performance, really short people, really tall people, or people with really short arm reach, really long arm reach, muscle strength, lots of muscle strength, little muscle strength. So we have this bell curve, and disabilities, you just add them on as a bump at either end of this bell curve and designed for a slightly wider range of abilities. You don't have to change your method of designing at all. You just need to make wider assumptions of the abilities people will bring. So that's why I think it's so sad that when we designed from the middle of this bell curve, then we end up with this big long laundry list of, you know, ADA compliance objectives when we didn't need to start there.
That's really interesting. And that was one thing that I was curious about too, is really where these two worlds come together between accessibility and human factors, because we were talking earlier about being able to influence guest behavior to make sure we're following the rules. And a lot of that is engaging all of their senses, but also, like you said, widening the assumptions to make sure that that it is fully accessible for all guests entirely. So thank you for elaborating on that. We really appreciate it. As we wind this down here, or can you share with us if people wanted to learn more, or they wanted to maybe reach out and say hello to you directly, where would you send them?
The best would be to Google me through Ryerson University, because they will keep up that link up to date. And I will probably have my link on the website with the word at, and, you know, because I don't want to have spam bots emailing me, but I welcome any actual human beings to find out my contact information from the Ryerson website and connect with me that way.
Well, luckily we have very few spam bots that listen or watch the Attraction Pros podcast. So I think we're safe with that. We don't know, you're right. That's why I said hopefully very, very small. But Kathryn, this was a fascinating conversation, and we really do appreciate your time. And for everybody out there who's watching and listening, just remember, we are all Attraction Pros. Thanks for listening to the Attraction Pros podcast.
Make sure to subscribe so you can tune in when new episodes release, and even better, please leave us a review on iTunes.
For more information, visit AttractionPros.com.